As you walk over the burial ground or round the church, do you ever consider how many people lie buried under your feet? Between the years 1575, when the first burials were registered, and 2009, there were interned in the graveyard and the church 9,583 bodies. Since there had been a church on this site from the 11th century, we can only guess how many people were buried during these preceding 500 years. Most of the burials are anonymous, and the majority of tombstones are of 19th century interments. The more important parishioners paid 6 shillings and 8 to be buried in the church itself. Some of the memorial slabs have survived, but many were moved when the floors were repaved, and over the years would have become illegible. There is a vault in the chancel which the Reverend John L. Fulford described as having stairs going down into it, where he could see candlesticks. We have no idea who is buried there, but it would have been some of the leading parishioners. Important people were buried in coffins, but the majority were wrapped in a shroud and put into the ground. The shrouds were made of linen until 1678, when it was enacted that everyone should be buried in a woolen shroud in order to boost the failing wool industry. The parish register notes that Richard Scott of Grindal was the first burial in wool in the parish in 1878. I am going to start this tour of the past inside the church with the most obvious of our monuments. Thomas Prideaux was the son of John Prideaux from Ashburton, who had a successful and lucrative career as a sergeant of law. The manor of Woodbury was amongst the numerous estates of the Grey family, which were escheated to the Crown on the execution of Lady Jane Grey. John Prideaux bought the manor and in addition the 4 parts of the manor of Nutwell from the daughters of John Dinham. He died in 1558, and the manors were left to his 10-year-old son Thomas. The date on the tomb of Thomas and Margaret, situated on the north side of the chancel, bore the date of 1610 on the north wall of the niche, according to a description given by a visiting clergyman in 1840, the date one assumes at which it was erected. There is no sign of this date now, so perhaps it disappeared during the alterations to that part of the chancel during the ministry of the Reverend John Loveburn Fulford. There is no record as to who carved it or how much it cost. The tomb appears incomplete as the panels on the side are empty and must have originally been intended for inscriptions concerning the effigies. There is a tradition that the tomb was brought from the chapel at Nutwell, possibly when that chapel was turned into a library. Or could St. Thomas and his wife be occupants of the vault? Who knows? Thomas married Margaret Cooper from Somerset and produced 4 sons and 3 daughters. As a member of the gentry, Thomas would have acted at the quarter sessions as a justice of the peace. In 1603 he was one of the many members of the gentry who received a knighthood at the accession of James I. When he died in 1605, his oldest son Thomas inherited the manors and estates, but was obliged to mortgage the manors to a lawyer from Wiltshire called Robert Jason. How Thomas Sr. had managed to bankrupt the estates is not known, but his son Thomas had huge debts too, due to many lawsuits in the courts of common pleas, some of them possibly being his father's. His son Amias too owed nearly £7,000 to people in London and in the neighbourhood. The manor of Woodbury was sold in 1633 to the Roll family, and Nutwell Court sold to Robert Jason, and finally to Henry Ford of Sprattsays in Littleham. Thomas Jr. inherited his title from his father, but sadly his son and heir died as a boy, and the direct male line came to an end. Sir Henry Ford was the posthumous son of Henry Ford of Bagtor in Ilsington, and Catherine, who was the daughter of George Drake of Sprattsays in Littleham, Exmouth. There Henry was baptised on the 19th of June 1617. He was sent to Exeter College, Oxford, where he matriculated in 1634. On 25th of Feb 1641 he married Eleanor, daughter of Sir Henry Roe of Middlesex, and had 3 sons and 4 daughters. His widowed mother remarried a John Clobbery of Bradstone, but the marriage was not a happy one. John noted in his will that she had failed in her duty as a Christian wife. In 1641 Amias Prideaux of Nuttall took out a mortgage of £3,750 on his manors of Woodbury, Nuttall and Limstone with a lawyer called Robert Jason. 2 years later the mortgage was assigned to Sir Henry Roe. In 1649 Henry Ford bought Nuttall Manor, including Nuttall Court, for £6,050. Henry Ford was a royalist sympathiser and was appointed a Justice of the Peace in 1644. He was a great companion of Thomas Clifford of Chudley, the future Lord Treasurer. He stood for Parliament for Lostwithiel in 1660 and again in 1662 for Newport, but was unsuccessful both times. But in 1664 he was elected as member for Tiverton at a by-election. He served twice as secretary to Lord Robartes, who was the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland in 1669 and 1672. In 1672 also he was made a commissioner for the sick and wounded and received a knighthood. His wife died in 1673 while he was in Dublin. In 1675 he was made a freeman of the city of Exeter. He was a firm supporter of the government and a splendid orator. By 1677 he had got into serious financial trouble and was obliged to place most of his lands in a trust to supply £1,000 each for his daughters, as well as pawning much of his silver. One daughter was to be disinherited if she married John Drake, possibly a cousin. He died at Nuttall in 1684 and was buried at Woodbury. Henry Pollocksfen was the oldest son of Andrew and Joan Pollocksfen of Sherford. His brother John was a merchant and political economist. Henry entered the Inner Temple in 1652 and was called to the bar in 1658. He married Mary Duncomber of Surrey in 1674 and settled in London. He became a bencher of his inn in 1674 and a leading practitioner on the Western Circuit. From this time he was involved in a variety of cases in London, including a famous one concerning the legality of the seizure of charters. As senior barrister on the Western Circuit, he presented the Crown's case against the Monmouth rebels at the Bloody Assizes in 1685. It is suggested that he opened the prosecution's case, leaving Sir George Jeffreys to hector witnesses and the accused. Henry was a vigorous supporter of William of Orange, who consulted him privately about the situation prevailing in the wake of James II's departure in 1688. He suggested that William would be justified in declaring himself king, a view most found extreme. In 1689, Exeter elected Henry to the Convention of Parliament, where he argued that the throne was vacant and that William should have the crown. This Parliament was elected to decide upon a constitutional settlement after the Glorious Revolution. In this Parliament he also worked on the Declaration of Rights and on the bill to suspend habeas corpus. Though William did not make himself king on Henry's advice, he nevertheless rewarded Henry with a knighthood in 1689 and appointed him as Chief Justice of Common Pleas. Henry Pollocksfen bought Nuttall Court and the manor of Nuttall from the executors of Sir Henry Ford in 1686. He died on 15th of Jan 1691 of a burst blood vessel in his home in Lincoln's Inn Fields, and was buried in the church at Woodbury. In his will he left Nuttall to his son Henry, aged 14. His daughter Elizabeth married Sir Francis Drake of Buckland, becoming his third wife. Henry Pollock Jr. married Gertrude, the daughter of Sir Francis Drake from his first marriage. Henry and Gertrude had no children, and so the estate passed to Francis Henry Drake, son of Sir Francis and Gertrude, and Henry's nephew. William was born about 1565, the son of Tristram Whatcombe, and farmed land in Ebford and Exton. The family was an East Devon one, the name being found also at Lyme Regis, Axminster, Branscombe and Collerton. In 1589 he married Agnes Bryant in Woodbury, and they produced an interesting and successful family. The oldest son, Tristram, moved to Kinsale in Ireland, where, with his brother-in-law, he ran a fishing fleet trading with Newfoundland. Grace married George Macy, a wealthy grocer in Exeter. William was apprenticed to George Macy and moved to Smyrna in Greece, where he settled and died as a wealthy merchant. Mary married Richard Salt, a mariner from Kinsale. Agnes married a Woodbury yeoman, Thomas Cook, who leased Withay's farm in Galliford and Higher Venmore farm. And finally Benjamin became a successful and wealthy London merchant, who owned a mansion house in Gloucestershire, and left a charitable sum to Woodbury. This money was to buy an estate, and from its revenues £5 was to be divided each year between the poorer of the villages of Ebford and Woodbury. This estate is still standing, but the £5, though still due, has not been paid for many years. The name of the estate is Stalkham House. One can surmise that William the father was a fairly wealthy man too, and had useful contacts for his son. William and his wife Agnes, who outlived him by 15 years, are both buried in the church and commemorated on a floor slab beside the organ. Their son William, who died in Smyrna in 1654, left in his will to my beloved mother Agnes Whatcombe, if she still be living, 2,000 royals of 8, not knowing that she had died 4 years previously. Philip Lempriere was born in Jersey in 1719, the second son of Jurat Michel Lempriere, seigneur of d'Element. The Lemprieres were the leading democratic family on the island. Philip's great-grandfather had been Cromwell's bailiff. His brother Charles was appointed lieutenant bailiff in 1750 and presided over the courts and states. Philip, through his ruthless collection of taxes as Receiver General, was a very unpopular man, yet his brother Charles appointed him as Attorney General in 1758. Eventually, political and family feuds and a popular uprising forced most of the family to resign their political positions. In 1770, Philip fled to England to his house in Southampton. The family were merchants and had houses and a business on the docks and a fishing interest in Newfoundland. It is possible that they were also dealing in arms and ammunition, as they owned a magazine on the docks. In 1767 he had married Mary Weeks, an heiress through her mother, and the stepdaughter of Charles Weeks, who owned Thorn Farm in the middle of Woodbury village. Charles's brother Thomas leased the tannery at Gilbrook and the one on Broadway. Charles was unable to fulfill the marriage settlement, and as a consequence Thorn Farm and all its lands was forfeited to his son-in-law. Philip had already bought a large part of the lands belonging to Springhayes in Town Lane, and on part of this he built Woodbury House. There is no record of what he did whilst he lived in Woodbury, and he did not appear to have taken on any parish responsibilities. He seems to have been rather unpleasant and ruthless man, which can be seen in the terms of his will. His wife Mary was shabbily treated, though she was offered the choice of living in his house at Southampton or Woodbury House. She chose the latter, where she resided until her death in 1799. In a codicil to his will, in addition to the use of his household goods during her widowhood, he left Mary an annuity of £300 on top of the original annuity of 100, stating that to be sufficient sum to live in decency, and if she made any difficulty he would bequeath her only 1 shilling in addition to the annuity. He also had left her all his silver, but in a further codicil he revokes that and leaves her only the silver which she had from her late father, the remainder going to his great-nephew. At the time he reduced the £300 annuity to 200, saying that sum should be sufficient for a single prudent woman to live comfortably. With regard to his funeral, he stipulated that he should be buried without any pomp, and his coffin to be plain wainscot, without any plate or ornament, and that 6 of his neighbours carry him to his grave, what they call underhand and not upon the shoulders, nor to have a hearse. He also directed that the expense saved from his simple funeral should be distributed amongst poor families of Woodbury. The Lempriere estates were left to his great-nephew, who was living in Lymington in Hampshire. He sold Woodbury House to a man called Graham Metcalfe Steele, and Thorn Farm and its lands to Lord Rolle. Jacob Butter was born in Woodbury in 1760, the eldest son of Jacob and Elizabeth Butter. He was probably apprenticed to Gilbert Langdon, who had been a chirosurgeon of Woodbury from 1730 to 1790. On Gilbert's death, Jacob succeeded him as Woodbury's doctor and lived in Higher Venmore Farm, where he held his surgery. The family was an interesting one, and several of them were very successful in life. Jacob had an uncle Bernard who died in 1822 in Bath, having made a fortune in Antigua. His brother James married Dr. Gilbert Langdon's daughter. Another brother, Benjamin, also owned several estates in Woodbury. Spent many years in a lunatic asylum, his mind, it was thought, having been disturbed by the death of his wife. Jacob's oldest son, John, became a doctor too, and was a founder of the Eye Hospital in Plymouth. His second son, Jacobus, also a doctor, succeeded his father in 1838, but sadly died 8 years later from dropsy. His daughter, Catherine, married James Ashford, whose descendants were well known in Topsham as doctors, as well as rugby players for England and cricketers for Devon. Jacob had a young brother James, who farmed Greendale Barton and also owned estates in Colleton Raleigh. James had a son who ran a tile and brick company at Greendale, at the back of the White Cross Inn, now the White Horse Inn, which unfortunately was bankrupted in the 1850s. The family contributed much to the village over 100 years and continued a medical tradition that began in 1730 with Gilbert Langdon, followed by Jacob and Jacobus, and for the next 25 years by Robert Brent. Rachel Wilkins was born in 1754 in the island of Antigua, the daughter of Thomas Jarvis, Chief Justice and first in council of the island. In 1776 she made a disastrous marriage to a ne'er-do-well called John Wilkins. They had 4 sons, the last Samuel being born in Brixham. By 1818 John and Rachel had moved to Woodbury and were renting the cottage at the bottom of Cottle's Lane. They were very poor, living in a damp old cottage, and John was a sick man who died in 1823 at the age of 75. Rachel wrote to her brother George Jarvis, a senior army officer, for financial help, and he sent regular payments to her until her death in 1840, aged 86. George Jarvis, now the owner of Doddington Hall in Lincolnshire, continued his charitable gift to Oswald, one of Rachel's sons, who had spent some time in the army but had been unemployed in Woodbury except for odd labouring jobs. Samuel, the youngest of her sons, who had a small army pension, also lived in the parish, lodging with different farmers. Oswald had married a local girl, Mary Soper, who was a lace maker, and they produced a family of 4 girls and a son. The family were kept out of poverty with the help of their uncle, and later his son, from Lincolnshire. Oswald and his wife died within a few months of each other in 1855, and the girls were left to fend for themselves. They scraped a living as lace makers, and even sent lace shawls to the wife of their cousin at Doddington Hall in gratitude for the financial aid he continued to send the family. The girls eventually married and moved to Exeter. Rachel, her son Oswald, and Mary, his wife, are all buried in the churchyard, but there is no memorial to her husband John or son Samuel, though they appear in the burial register. A sad tale of a woman who was brought up in a wealthy landed family but lost everything through a bad marriage. One of Rachel's sisters married Lachlan Macquarie, who was the governor of Australia from 1810 to 1821. Oswald, the grandchild of the governor of Antigua and nephew of the governor of Australia, was recorded as a labourer in Woodbury censuses. One wonders whether his descendants are aware of their background in Antigua. Do any of our labouring ancestors have such a heritage? Robert Medley Fulford was the second son of John Loveburn Fulford. He was born in St Thomas in Exeter in 1845, when his father had been the curate there. His middle name was taken from the name of Bishop Medley of Canada, who had been the rector of St David's when his father had been his curate in the early 1840s. Robert trained as an architect and designed many ecclesiastical and other buildings of importance in the Diocese of Exeter, including Woodbury School. He was responsible for the architectural work for the restoration of St Swithin's in 1894, and he became a member of the Exeter Diocesan Architectural Society in 1867, and succeeded his father as secretary of that society. He wrote several papers for the society on aspects of church architecture in Devon and abroad. Robert married Marion Hayman in 1873. He had met her when her father, Dr. Philip Hayman, was living in O'Kays in Woodbury. They had 3 children whilst they were living in Faircombe House in St Sidwell's parish in Exeter, but sadly Marion died in 1888 at the age of 40. The next we hear of Robert is in 1891, when he was appointed as deacon, then curate, at the Pro-Cathedral of Christchurch at Ballarat in Australia. Perhaps he went out to Australia when Marion died and took holy orders out there. He returned to England in 1893 and served as a curate to his father for 4 years, with some time also spent in Crediton. In 1896 he went as curate to St Andrew's Church on the island of Grenada, where he stayed for 2 years. After a year in London, he finally settled at Hennock, where he was appointed vicar. Robert was a great traveller and an eccentric, full of fun, enthusiasm and energy. In an obituary of him by a close friend, he describes him as a tall, striking figure with a patriarchal beard divided and streaming over each shoulder. As he tramped about the countryside on his trips abroad, he would wear a wide-brimmed clerical hat turned up at the sides and carry a large artist's holdall. He would stop and draw or paint wherever he went, and admitted to never cleaning his paint box, which was evidently like a blacking pot. Robert was very musical and composed and played the organ from an early age. He was the church organist in Woodbury for a time at the age of 9. He had a full, rich singing voice and sung with great emotion and gusto. An interesting character and gifted in music, art, architecture and archaeology. He spoke with knowledge and enthusiasm on a variety of subjects and showed a boyish sense of humour with a suspicion of Devon pronunciation. He remained a widower at Hennock, living with his youngest daughter, where he was much loved by his parishioners, and especially by children. His zest for life and energy continued up until his death in 1910 at the age of 65. After his funeral, a Woodbury woman at his grave was heard to say, "Ah, sir, that was a good man." Several older Woodburyans will remember Flo serving in her husband Sam's general store in Wellpark House next to the parish room. Her husband was a seller of oil and other ironmongery goods and travelled with his cart around the local villages. Their daughter Ivy Stamp eventually took over the shop, which was remembered in her day as a sweet shop. What most people did not realise was that Florence was the granddaughter of a man called Samuel Thomas, who with his brothers and sisters left their home and estates in Barbados to settle in England. Whilst his siblings moved into Clifton in Bristol, living on private means, Samuel married an illiterate girl, had 2 children living with her in Hevertree. He moved to Woodbury and rented Thornlea, which was then a small cottage. He eventually bought Isle Cottage, the beautiful house which stood opposite the village green and which was demolished in the early 1900s to build the 2 large semi-detached houses in its extensive garden, and brought up a family of 7 children. When Samuel died in 1877, his son John Branford Thomas moved into the house with his wife and large family. Tragedy hit the family when his wife died in 1892 at the age of 38, leaving him to bring up the children with the help of his older sister and brother. Something obviously went very wrong as the older children all gradually fled their home. In 1901, the brother Samuel attempted to cut his throat at Isle Cottage, and 3 months later, on bail to appear before the magistrates on a charge of attempted self-murder, hanged himself in a field at Exmouth. This was bad enough, but the inquest disclosed that Samuel had been supporting with his own money his nephews and nieces because their father, John Branford, drank all his money away. Florence was the saviour of her sisters, who had all escaped the house because, as one of them said at the inquest, she had left her father because he was so disagreeable and had been a drunkard all his life. Not only did Florence and Sam Miller look after the young Thomas girls, but also sent 2 of the girls to live with Sam's married brother in Woolwich. Florence's father, John Branford, moved from Woodbury after his brother's death and rented a small cottage in Offwell until he moved to the Union Poorhouse in Honiton, where he died. He too is buried in Woodbury in a grave with his wife and a daughter, who died at the age of 13. Florence's great-grandfather had been a wealthy man in Barbados, holding estates and slaves, who in Woodbury would have imagined that Flo at the shop had such a heritage. Joseph was the son of Samuel, an affluent farmer who leased several farms in the parish. His great-grandfather had come to Woodbury from Bradnich in the mid-1700s as a blacksmith, living in a large dwelling known for many years as Lindsay's. This house was divided into several dwellings in the 19th century, and in the following century had become ruinous and was demolished. His descendants also worked as blacksmiths, but diversified into farming and other occupations, becoming yeomen and gentlemen by the 19th century. The accounts for the church give many instances of work done by the early Lindsay blacksmiths, and probably some of their work can still be seen in the village. Joseph became a leading light in the administration of the parish, becoming the registrar for Woodbury. In 1831 he was appointed as clerk to the vestry, and for over 20 years was assistant overseer of the poor. Joseph set up as a blacksmith in a group of shops in the Beales estate in 1832, and married Mary, the daughter of John Beale Voysey, who had a butcher's shop there. By 1847 he had taken over the licence of the Globe Inn at the top of Globe Hill, a very busy and lucrative pub, and as well remarrying a local widow 5 months after the death of Mary. This pub had many uses apart from its usual one of being a very popular and well-frequented hostelry. When the Woodbury Volunteers Royal Artillery was first formed, it was used as its headquarters. The annual ploughing match banquets were held there, alternately with the White Hart, and large gatherings came to which local MP and dignitaries attended. It was also used as the courthouse for the Woodbury and District Petty Sessions, until the county built the courthouse on Globe Hill. Joseph continued to have an interest in the pub for many years, but also leased Webber's farm, where he lived with his daughter and son-in-law Henry Glanville, brother of Philip Glanville's great-great-grandfather. Joseph bought the patch of green now called the Green Spot, once the village pound, and built 4 cottages upon it. In 1868 these cottages were completely destroyed by fire, and he also leased the 3 school cottages opposite the Green Spot, which were damaged by the fire too. Joseph was a great supporter of Colonel Robert Brent and became a sergeant major in the Woodbury RA Volunteers, having previously been a sergeant in the Woodbury Yeomanry. William Kiba Martin was born in Oxfordshire in 1877, son of the Reverend Charles Martin of Oxford. In 1891 his father was appointed rector of Dartington, and William had his first taste of Devon, where he became interested in natural history. He studied botany, Greek philosophy and church history at Oxford, and then went to Cuddesdon Theological College to train for the priesthood. His early life was spent as a curate in the north of England, and he then served as an army chaplain in the First World War. In 1921 he was offered the benefice of Hackham and Coffinswell, and became the archpriest there, bringing up a family of 4 children. He had married his childhood sweetheart in 1909 in Derbyshire. In 1949 he retired and settled in Gidley, but 10 years later he moved to Woodbury with his wife, who sadly died in 1964. The following year he remarried again. Throughout his life he had sketched and painted wild flowers as well as other wildlife, but after 60 years, at the age of 88, this passionate hobby culminated in his book The Concise British Flora, which was published to great acclaim and reviews, and the foreword to the book was written by the Duke of Edinburgh. After the huge success of the book, he was interviewed on radio and television, was asked to illustrate a set of Royal Mail stamps, and became a national celebrity. Woodbury honoured his achievement by using his illustrations when it was decided to produce the beautifully worked hassocks in the church, many of which are based on his paintings. In his obituary in the Woodbury News, he was described as a gentle soul living quietly amongst the community of Woodbury for many years, who helped the vicar with services and visiting, and tended his garden and walked the lanes. As the editor of the Woodbury News wrote, "Fame did not spoil him. He remained a simple man, touched by true humility and moved by beauty in all he saw. Everyone here who knew and loved him will realize that they have lost sight of something rare. A man who used to the full his time and his talents, and spent his life in the service of others, and, with simple humility, knew how to be a famous man." Bob Templar was born in Ceylon in 1900, a descendant of Alexander Templar, the founder of a Devon family in the 16th century. The family is best known in Devon for James Templar, who in the 18th century bought a large tract of land on which he built Stover House, and later the Dartmoor Railway to the stone quarries. He was a third cousin of one of Bob's ancestors. Bob was commissioned into the Royal Artillery in 1922 and spent 6 years in India. During the 1930s he was appointed adjutant of the Devon Yeomanry, married Anne Henderson in 1934 and settled down to raise a family in Silverton. In 1939 he was posted to Hong Kong, where the family were living when the Japanese entered the war. Anne and the children attempted to get a boat to freedom, but unfortunately ended up as prisoners of the Japanese and were imprisoned in Manila until the end of the war. She showed her strength of character in dealing with daily life there and keeping herself and 3 small children alive. It is hard for ordinary people to envisage what brutal treatment they had to endure for 3.5 years. Bob remained in Hong Kong to try and defend the colony, but in vain, and he was captured and remained in Japanese hands until hostilities ceased. He was incidentally the first cousin of the eminent soldier Field Marshal Sir Gerald Templar, who served out in the Far East too during the war. After their repatriation, Bob and Anne bought Parsonage House in 1949 and settled to a happy and very productive life in our community. Together they founded the Woodbury News at the time when houses were being built in Woodbury and new young families moving into the parish. They felt that a magazine would introduce newcomers to the village and advertise all that went on in the community. Bob took up serious beekeeping with hives in the parish and in other parts of Devon. He had been taught this skill of keeping bees whilst a prisoner of war. He involved himself with the British Legion and much that went on in the parish, as well as interesting himself with a variety of diverse activities from stamp collecting to ham radio. He died in 1986 and was much missed by the community. Anne too threw herself into village activities and was always ready to assist in any way. After her husband died, Anne moved from Parsonage House to Puffins, where she spent hours in her garden, which was her great love. How upset she would have been now to see what has happened to her old garden. Even in her 80s, she was one of the first people to offer help whenever the History Society asked for volunteers. She compiled the directory of the Woodbury News until shortly before she left Woodbury to go into a home near to where her son lived. She died in 2004, aged 92. Obituaries of both Bob and Anne Templar were written in the Woodbury News by Mrs. Brighouse, from which I have quoted. Here we have 2 gravestones. We will deal with the left-hand one first. In 1873, Alfred Stokes, a brother of my great-grandfather, followed his brother Harry to work on the sugar plantations in Demerara. He rose rapidly through the ranks and became an overseer or foreman at a sugar estate called Enmore, and a few years later he was made deputy manager. In 1885, Alfred married a Georgetown girl, Jessie Craig. Although they lived and worked in Demerara, they made regular visits to Woodbury, and Jessie had 5 of her 7 children in the village, one of the births being at Sydney Cottage and one at Ailsa Cottage, both in the Broadway. On the collapse of the sugar industry in South America, they eventually returned to live permanently in the village, and Jessie died in 1908, aged only 45, and Alfred in 1914, aged 63. Both had died from consumption. The grave on the right in the previous slide is that of Jessie's father. His name was John Brown Craig. He lived at Ailsa House in Georgetown, a name believed to have been taken from the cottage here in Woodbury. John Brown Craig was not a local man, but hailed originally from Scotland. He was for 25 years, in the latter quarter of the 19th century, the managing engineer of the Georgetown Waterworks, and this is inscribed on his gravestone. Jessie was a child of his first marriage to a Demerara girl, but on his wife's death he married again and had a second family. He died aged 58 in 1891 whilst visiting Jessie here in Woodbury, and was buried in the churchyard. Alfred and Jessie were later buried in the grave beside him, where 2 of their children, both aged 2 years, had been previously buried. A young man of 26 called Thomas Daley, a mason by trade, became Woodbury's first official sub-postmaster. The Western Times announced that from the 12th of June 1866, the post office in Woodbury is now open for the receipt of proposals for the insurance of lives or purchase of government annuities, and for the receipt of premiums. Thomas Peter Daley was a well-read man with a great interest in history. Before becoming a postman in Woodbury and later sub-postmaster, he qualified as a master mason. He kept both occupations going until he retired, when his son William took over the post office. He employed two of his daughters as telegraphists according to the 1891 census, and 10 years later his two sons William and Tom are described as telegraph clerks. William's grandson, John Daley, who was born in 1905, told me that it was Thomas who built the stone wall from the fountain in Globe Hill up through the arch to the church. This must have been a major construction project at the time, although just before the White Hart, the wall has a significant outward lean to it. It has been like this all my lifetime. Maybe they had one too many in the pub at lunchtime and forgot what vertical was. However, it has never moved and is still standing as good as ever. It happens to be my garden wall, so I know it quite well. William Daley was quite young when he was appointed sub-postmaster. He married Alice Maud and they lived in the rambling building, which also housed the post office and general store. The post office was situated at the entrance of the road leading to the church and is now used as an antique shop. He worked very hard with long hours and 7 days a week. He rose at 5 a.m. to receive the mail and help the postman sort the letters. There were two full-time postmen, Sid Knott and Fred Curtis, and one part-timer. Sid Knott was better at forecasting the weather than the BBC apparently. If he came with a cape, you knew it would rain. On Fridays there would be quite a queue of people waiting to come in and draw the old age pension. Quite a few couldn't write, so he gave them some copying ink, pencil and a specimen signature and told them to go home and practice writing it. They couldn't write anything else, but it gave them a lot of pleasure to be able to sign the pension book when other people could see them doing it. William Daley helped many people in different ways, writing letters for a gypsy family, making people's wills and giving useful advice about saving money. He took an interest in the affairs of the village, was a rebel on the parish council and sought to preserve the rights of the village with regard to walking on the common. He started a Boy Scouts troop and each November he organised a splendid carnival, lighting up the post office with Chinese lanterns. On one occasion he entered the fancy dress parade himself, going as John Bull. Miss Moulton Barrett, who lived in Preston House, lent him a bulldog, but apparently he was rather afraid of it. The post office had a Morse sounder with a call sign WNF, Whiskey November Foxtrot. There were a lot of telegrams sent and received, and he became an excellent telegraphist. This enabled him to join the signals section of the Royal Engineers, and he spent a few years in France during the war. His wife and her sister managed the post office and shop during this period, and a telephone was installed. After the war, now in the new post office, which he built in 1912, where it still stands, he expanded the business and delivered groceries to distant homes and farms. He helped the clergy quite a lot in all sorts of ways, first the Reverend Neely, and then the Reverend Dr. Fulford, and he was one of those who presided at the dedication of the Lamb Park Cemetery, where he now lies buried. After a fairly long illness, he died of a fibrous tumour in 1948. The post office and business continued in the capable hands of his daughter Winifred and her husband James Briggs. He always taught his family not to repeat anything that was given to them in confidence, and I will add just two examples of the way he worked as sub-postmaster. One occasion, when stamping the letters from the post office letterbox, he came across a poison pen postcard addressed to a well-known man in the village, accusing him quite wrongly of being a wicked rascal. He showed the postcard to his son, who asked him what he was going to do with it. He simply said, "I am going to tear this up and put the pieces in the waste paper basket." On another occasion, an elderly man was very ill and sent for William to go and see him. He said, "Mr. Daley, I have not long to live, and I would like to draw all my money from the post office savings bank and close the account." After a few days, a letter came from the bank giving authority for the money to be paid. William, with wife Alice as witness, took the money, quite a large sum, to the sick man. He said, "I want you to keep the money and divide it amongst my family after the funeral." He died shortly afterwards, and his family were pleased that their legacies were paid in full in such a short time. What an opportunity for a dishonest postmaster, which of course he most certainly was not. However, little did he realize in 1912 what problems his decision to build a new post office in Broadway would cause 100 years later. Back then, of course, there was no problem when crossing the road. Round about 1870, Harry Stokes, my great-grandfather, joined a partnership with a person called Hooper, and for a few years they ran a carpentry and bell-hanging business together. Dumbbells, which are apparently a silent training apparatus for ringers, were installed at Chewton Mendip in Somerset in 1880, and a press report says that their wheels and headstocks were made by the bell-hangers Hooper and Stokes of Woodbury and Devon. By 1881 they had parted company, and Harry Stokes was trading on his own account. In 1882 his team did work and installed an Elecom chiming apparatus in York Minster. In 1891 they manufactured and installed a two-tier oak frame at St. Peter's Church in Guernsey. This was a very small tower, hence they had to go one above the other to get the four bells in. In 1902 the bells at Limestone were installed in a new iron frame, which represented the first of such construction in Devonshire by a local bell hanger, and the press said supplied substantial proof of a determination not to let the county to be behind in the matter of home provision of the most modern and scientific methods of bell hanging. The contractor has been Mr. Harry Stokes of Woodbury, and the neatness of the frame and the go of the bells evoked the highest expressions of approval, while the excellent matching of the new bell and the increased beauty of the peal excited the general admiration. By 1918 the firm had attended more than 300 churches, mainly in the southwest of England, but on several occasions they travelled to distant parts of the UK to fit new frames or refurbish the existing. There are still several of the original oak frames still in situ in towers in Devon, which are over 100 years old and still going strong. On the left here is a typical oak frame that was made at their Fernley works. Besides the bell hanging business, the firm was involved in general domestic building and repair work. They also operated an undertaking business in the village and surrounding area. They were high-class carpenters and asked to give an estimate for the complete reseating of St. Swithin's Church in 1913, which is seen on the right-hand side of this slide. The total cost for this was £245 16 shillings for the complete reseating of the whole church, and the final bill is seen here. Prior to this, in 1903, they had taken instruction from the Fulford family to construct a new lich gate at the entrance to the church. This was funded by the Fulfords and erected in the memory of a family member, Mr. C.R. Fulford, who died in South Africa. The total cost of this was £58 18 shillings. Apart from his business activities, Harry Stokes was the first chairman of the newly formed parish council in 1894. This was in a transitional capacity for 1 year until things levelled out. On December the 11th, 1910, he became one of the first directors of the new Woodbury Public Hall Company, along with 5 others, and helped to steer things in the right direction for the building of the new hall. Abraham Berry was an agricultural machinist by trade at his engineering works on the Green. It was here that they made and repaired all sorts of agricultural and milling equipment for the local area. It was a major family business at the time and survived right up into the mid-1950s, when the premises became the main Morgan car dealership for the southwest. Now, of course, it is houses. His grave is situated just above the yew tree on the main path up to the church. In 1871 his name was put forward, amongst others, by the vestry committee to become a parish constable, but as the new courthouse had recently been built, their services were never required. They would have been a bit like the equivalent of today's special constables or PCSOs. Abraham was the first captain of the Woodbury Fire Brigade, which was horse-drawn throughout its entire life. No sirens, just the bugler sounding the charge. The brigade was formed in the 1860s following a series of devastating fires both in Woodbury itself and also Woodbury Salterton. The original fire engine was bought by Robert Brent, who paid for it himself, and it was operated by the Woodbury Volunteers. Money was raised by subscription to build a shed over the brook in Myery Lane to house it in. Being adjacent and also the captain of the brigade, he held the keys, so if there was a fire, quick action could take place. Coincidentally, it was Abraham's son George who was the last captain of the brigade in 1929 when it was disbanded. In the process of updating the church burial records, as I have in the last year, one particular grave came to my notice as being completely different from all the others. Its inscription bears not a famous or unusual story, but one of great sadness. This is the grave of the Mitchell family, which is just under the large yew tree coming up the main drive. Thomas Mitchell of Ottery St Mary had married Mary Force, a Woodbury girl, on the 8th of April 1800 in St Swithin's Church. It is recorded that altogether they had over a period 13 children, whilst they were living in Limstone to where they had moved. The first 5 may have survived, but this is not really known, but 7 out of the following 8 certainly did not. If we take a closer look at the gravestone on the left, there are recorded these 7 child deaths, which happened with grim regularity. Baby John in 1809, aged 1 month. Mary in 1811, aged 3 months. Another Mary in 1812, aged 2 months. Yet another Mary in 1813, aged 9 months. Nancy in 1814, aged 5 months. James in 1818, who lasted for 17 months. And Harriet in 1821, aged just 5 weeks. It is difficult to imagine in this scenario that the others survived, but they could perhaps be buried at Limstone if they didn't. These 7 are buried in the grave of Josias Force, who was Mary's father, which is even stranger, but because they died before their parents, this was probably the only solution. By the time Thomas died in 1832 and Mary in 1846, there was no room left in the family grave, so they have a separate one which is adjacent. This is a very sad story to me, but no doubt epitomizes the period of time in which they lived. You either lived or you died. There was not much in between. When you walk around Woodbury Churchyard, all you basically see at first glance is a lot of perhaps anonymous gravestones, some standing, some leaning, and some fallen over. However, when you research some of them, interesting facts emerge, which are not necessarily immediately apparent. And I hope you have found this evening that some of these stones have been brought back to life. The thing to remember in all of this is that all of these people have been what could be classed as the pioneers of Woodbury over their periods in office here, both the famous and the not so famous. They have all played their part in the building up of what is now the place where we live today and call home. I wonder what it would have been like here now if they hadn't done their bit. Who knows? Finally, I'm sure you would like to know what these people would have had to pay for their privilege of being buried here. These were the going rates in 1826. It all depended if you were an in-parishioner or an out-parishioner. That's if you lived in the parish or you didn't. If you lived here, it was cheaper by half. If you wished to be buried inside the church, it was 10 guineas for an out-parishioner and 5 guineas for someone who lived here. The rules and measurements allowed were very strict, and there were variable prices for burial outside in the churchyard, again being different for in and out parishioners. You can take a longer look at these from the documents on the table. So that's it. We hope you haven't had too grave an evening.